I tiptoed slowly through the dark hallways of the ancient hospice care. I'd only been awake for a few minutes, and my eyes felt heavy with sleep. At first, I couldn't quite put my finger on what exactly had interrupted my slumber. It had been a sound, I knew that much, but it was too distant and muffled to properly comprehend. My first instinct had been to wake up my mother, but her bed had been emptied, messy and cold. She'd clearly been gone for a while. Still, her instructions had been clear. Stay in the room at night, and don't go outside to look for trouble. But to a 7-year-old child, without their mother for comfort, every howl of the wind and creak of old wood turned malicious. I knew I'd get in trouble if I left our room, but my fear of being alone far outweighed the orders I'd been given. As I left the room, I could have sworn I heard the faint sounds of a man crying in the distance. He sounded like he needed help. I decided to visit the nursing station on the ward, hoping my mother would be there and that someone could assist the crying man. It wasn't far to walk, but in the darkness I could hardly see 2 feet in front of me. The lights had been turned off for the night, giving the patients some much-needed rest. Since I didn't know where the main switch was situated, I had to rely on my own memory and walls for support. "Hello?" I called out as I approached the nursing station. It had been abandoned, with little more than few books and a cold cup of tea left behind. "Mom?" No response. All that existed around me were the empty hallways filled with little more than the sobs from a broken man. I should have been more afraid, but having spent the majority of my life around sick and dying people had given me a different perspective on what it meant to be human. Rather than fearing the strange sounds before me, I pitied whoever created them, and if the nurses weren't around to help them, then I had to take action. There was an old rechargeable flashlight in one of the cupboards. It was frequently used during the many power outages at the hospice. I decided to snatch it to make my way easier, promising to put it back before anyone would notice. "Hello? Mister, are you okay?" I uttered in a half-whisper. I was afraid to wake up the other patients, but I still foolishly tried to reach out to him. It was hard to gauge where exactly the sound was coming from. It sounded muffled, and the way it echoed through the hallway disoriented me too much to accurately judge. The hospice had been poorly designed, with endlessly long hallways dimly lit up by the street lights through the small windows. It was a true labyrinth of darkness, one that was hard to navigate even during the day. Had it not been for the vast amount of time I spent there, I would have gotten lost immediately. "Where are you, mister?" I called out again. But in response to my soft calls, I only received more sobs. They were intermittently interrupted by the briefest of sentences. In a way, it sounded like the man was arguing with himself, shooting incoherent messages back and forth. "Hello?" I asked, daring to let out a bit louder that time. Still no response, save the hopeless cries. I kept wandering the halls, trying to figure out where everyone had gone. The voice of the crying man just sounded further and further away. But behind the echo, I started to realize that the sound wasn't coming from the ward itself, but from down below. The man was in the basement. It was pretty much the only room left in the facility that I had yet to visit. Separated from the ward by a rusty metal door, it was strictly off limits to everyone save for the janitor. According to my mother, it housed little more than backup generators and some tools, thus it was deemed too dangerous for regular staff. But if a patient had gotten lost down there, maybe I could help him get out again. The heavy door creaked as I pushed it open. Behind it lay nothing more than pitch-black darkness. The cries that had once been muffled were finally freed from their echoing prison of 4-inch metal, and I knew I was heading in the right direction. "Hello?" I called out again. And just like before, the voices only returned incoherent rambles. "I don't want to be here. Please, I'm not supposed to be here. I just want to go. Please, let me go," the voice cried. With the broken begging, I finally recognized the voice. It was Mr. Henderson, a man who suffered from terminal cancer. He was one of the patients I'd spent the most time with, happily sitting at his bedside as he told me stories from his youth. But he had died a week prior, his body finally giving out to the spreading poison within him. He couldn't possibly be the one trapped in the basement. At the young age, I still hadn't properly grasped the concept of death. Though I knew that every person ended their journey on Earth at some point, it felt like a foreign, distant idea. At the moment I stood in the staircase, staring into the dark abyss below, I almost felt happy to hear his voice again. "Mr. Henderson, did you get lost?" I called out as I walked down the narrow staircase. He just kept sobbing. "It hurts to be here. Let me go." "No, I'm staying. This is my world," he said, his sob returning into a twisted chuckle. It sounded so forced, as if someone who'd never heard laughter their entire life was trying to fake it based on written down instructions. As I descended into the basement, I felt the air around me grow thick. I felt so small to wander beneath the heavy concrete walls and ceiling, with no one there to guide my way. The flashlight I wielded barely touched the shadows before me, and it was already starting to run dry. "Mr. Henderson," I repeated, "are you okay?" Once I reached the bottom, my light barely produced a visible beam. I took a break to swirl around the charging handle, desperately trying to illuminate my harrowing surroundings. After I felt I had a satisfying charge, I shined the light around the damp, dark room, expecting to find a bunch of crates or equipment. Instead, I found out the basement was far larger than I'd ever imagined. Instead of being a singular room, it was a hallway rid of any light, with several metal doors lining the walls on each side. It looked almost like the ward above me, except it had no windows, nor any staff in sight. The cries were coming from a room near the end, and it was growing in intensity for each step I took towards it. It didn't even sound real anymore. It was too loud, broken, and wet. I walked over to the door and gently pulled it open. Inside, I found a singular bed with a broken chain attached to the wall. Mr. Henderson himself stood in one of the corners, just facing the wall. He let out a couple more sobs, banging his head slowly against the cold concrete. He was naked, and his body had grown sickly thin, even in comparison to how he looked shortly before his death. His ribs protruded violently through his paper-thin skin. He seemed nothing like the man I'd known, but it was still him. Then I noticed something else. A woman lying on the floor a few feet away from him. It was my mother. She was unconscious, and she had a large gash covering the side of her head. A broken flashlight lay next to her body, and in her hand, she held onto her ancient Zippo lighter. "Mom!" I yelled as I ran to help her. Only then did Mr. Henderson finally pay me any attention. He turned his head towards me with a jerky twist and took a few bizarrely unbalanced steps towards me. His limbs moved in inhumane ways, akin to a marionette being controlled by an unseen entity. "I'm here. I'm here. I'm here," he half sobbed, half laughed. "Why did you come here? You're not supposed to be here. I'm not me. I will hurt you. You will be the next one." He took a long, unsteady step towards me while I frantically tried to shake my mother awake. "Why did you come down here? Why? Why didn't you just let me die?" he yelled as he walked even closer. "Mom, wake up," I yelled as I shook her knocked-out body. "Leave," Dr. Henderson shouted, taking another few doll-like steps towards me. I got to my feet and backed away from my mother. My hands were trembling at the man standing before me. Whoever he had once been had long since been lost, and I hadn't the faintest clue what had taken his place. "I want to die again. Why are you keeping me here?" he asked. The acolytes will come. You are but the first vessel." One voice was Mr. Henderson's. Though distraught and damaged, it felt like him. The other one belonged to something else entirely. A dark force that filled the basement with dread. I turned around to flee, but the door had shut behind me. The pathetic flashlight I carried had once again begun to fade. Left without any chance of escape, I just froze in fear, unable to comprehend the situation that was unfolding before me. Then, Mr. Henderson swung his arm towards the wall. He let out a groan as a loud crack was heard. He'd broken his own arm, causing the bone to protrude out through his flesh. He lifted his mangled arm, getting ready to strike me. "I need to kill you. It will be better for you," he said with a sob. I lifted my arms to defend myself, screaming for my mother to help me. Mr. Henderson brought down his broken bone with incredible speed. It hit my shoulder, cutting deep into my flesh. I cried in agony and, "Mom!" I was jolted awake by my son, Alex, standing at the foot of my bed. He wore a worried expression on his face, one I'd come to know all too well in the recent weeks. "Did you have another bad dream?" he asked. I was too out of breath to respond. I just looked down at my shoulder, making sure the wound was little more than a distant memory. It still displayed the scars from the following surgery, but at least the pain had vanished years earlier. "I'm okay, Alex. It was just a dream," I lied. The truth was far too complicated for his young mind to understand. Even I hadn't come to terms with the events that took place 2 decades earlier. Officially, I'd hurt myself on a piece of broken glass, but the truth still lingered in my mind. "What are you doing awake already?" I asked as I glanced at the time. It was barely 7, early even by Alex's standards. He pointed to the stairs with a puzzled look. "There's a man outside. He says he knows my grandma." It struck me as an odd coincidence. I hadn't spoken to my mother since I was a child, so to have someone show up at my doorstep the same week as I was having nightmares about her felt all too connected. Still, I was too tired to question it. "I'll be right down. Just go get ready for breakfast. You can even have some of that cereal you love so much." With that explicit permission, Alex scurried away. He was only 6, but he'd already grown so much. He had a pure heart full of kindness, all in spite of the complicated life we've led so far. I got out of bed, still soaked in sweat from the nightmare. They felt so real, making it feel as if I had returned to the horrible basement at Tenebrae Hospice Care. The whole place was a dreadful one, the end station for people needing end-of-life care. All I could do was splash some cold water onto my face before I threw on whatever clothes I'd worn the day before. I knew I'd look like shit, but it didn't matter. Once I finally made it to the door, I found a man in his mid-30s standing outside. He wore a perfectly tailored suit with silver cufflinks. He smiled politely as he saw me, reaching out his hand to introduce himself. "My name is John Riley. You must be Miss Laura Florence." I nodded as I grabbed his hand. It was a firm handshake, but I still didn't understand whether he wanted to sell me something or if he actually knew my mother like he claimed. I'm sorry to interrupt you this early on a Sunday, but I'm here on behalf of Agatha Florence. She was your mother, correct?" Her name sounded so odd. No one had ever called her Agatha before. It was always Aggie by her friends and Mrs. Florence if she spoke to patients. For a moment, I just tried to remember what she looked like. Even in my dreams, her face had always been obscured, as if she was a stranger. Then it hit me. He mentioned her in the past tense. Wait, did you say, was my mother? His smile vanished as he realized he inadvertently told me my mother had died. "I'm so sorry, Miss Florence. Your mother passed away a month ago. I thought you already knew." This news took a moment to truly register with me. At first, I felt sad, but then I realized just how long it had been since I last saw her. The sadness quickly faded, and was replaced by an overwhelming sense of disappointment. "Do you mind if I come in for a moment?" he asked. Without even thinking to refuse, I just gestured in the general direction of the kitchen. I led the way and he followed me inside. Alex had already started breakfast, working on a bowl of cereal that contained far too much sugar. Mr. Riley placed himself in the doorway, waiting patiently for permission to come inside. "Alex, hon, could you give us a few minutes? You can go watch some TV while you eat." Alex excitedly rushed out of the kitchen. It was an unusual treat for him to eat on the couch, so he didn't hesitate for even a second. "Please, have a seat. Would you like some coffee or something?" I asked. He just shook his head. "No, thank you. I'm trying to cut down on my caffeine intake." Still, I mindlessly started working on a pot of coffee. Mr. Riley sat himself down by the kitchen table and put a briefcase in front of him. "I'm a lawyer that used to work for the same hospice facility as your mother. Tenebrae Care, you know the name?" he asked. I thought back to the few memories I had of the place. While they weren't particularly pleasant ones, I still felt oddly connected to the place. The horrors I could remember seemed vague, as if they never had happened. If not for the frequent nightmares to remind me, I probably wouldn't have believed it. Yes, I spent a lot of time in one of the guest rooms. My mother was a nurse there. Mr. Riley nodded in agreement. She actually worked there as recently as last year. She meant a great deal to both the staff and the patients at the facility. She was a good woman. I almost let out a chuckle at that last statement. A good woman. The person who had abandoned me at age 7 sent me away to live with my grandparents. They hated her. They truly did, despite her being their own daughter. According to them, she was absolutely insane. "I didn't really know her that well," was the only answer I could muster up. He looked slightly disappointed at my response. Still, he put on a kind smile and opened one of the documents. "As her lawyer, it's my job to carry out her last will and testament. While she didn't have much in terms of money, she did leave behind her house and the room she owned at Tenebrae Care. It's not worth a lot, but it's something. In addition, she left you this," he said as he handed me a neatly wrapped up package. It was light, but I didn't want to open it without knowing its content. "What is it?" I asked. "I'm not sure. It was already wrapped up and addressed to you when I picked it up," he said, allowing a hint of curiosity to escape through his voice. I unwrapped the paper with trembling hands and found a heavily worn, leather-bound journal inside. On it, my mother's name had been engraved as Aggie Florence. These were all her thoughts and memories that remained on this earth, all from a life I'd never known. At first, I just stared at it in disbelief. I'd honestly never cared much about knowing my mother. To me, she was just a crazy woman that abandoned me as a child. But with the lawyer giving a whole different story, I was starting to doubt myself for the first time in years. "Miss Florence, I know it might be a traumatic thing to relive old memories, believe me, but it would be greatly helpful if you could accompany me back to Tenebrae to get this paperwork out of the way. Then we can transfer whatever assets that belong to your mother, or at least sell them." The idea didn't bring me any joy. Tenebrae was a part of my past, a place that had broken my mind as a young girl. Still, the curious bone in my mind wouldn't rest all that easy. If my mother hadn't been the psychotic woman I'd been led to believe, then why had she sent me away? "Can I have some time to think about it?" I finally asked. Mr. Riley nodded understandably. He pulled out a business card from his inner pocket. It was just a plain black piece of paper with the name of his company and his phone number on it. "I'm staying in town until tomorrow. Just call me if you have any questions." With that, he excused himself and I was left alone in the kitchen. Alex was still enjoying his TV time, blaring cartoons loudly throughout the house. I should have joined him for breakfast, but I lost my appetite. All I wanted were answers. Answers that might be hidden within that very diary. I had to do it. I took a deep breath and opened the book to a random page about halfway through the diary. April 18th, 1997. Mr. Clark arrived at the building today for the final time. It has only been a month since I last saw him, and now it's more clear than ever that he's standing on death's doorstep. Cancer is a horrible disease, and it has taken Mr. Clark out of remission with a vengeance spreading to his lungs and brain. He has lost most of the brilliant man he once used to be, but he still plays the piano like an angel. Even in his current state, the muscle memory lingers, a window into his former self. He told me he's ready, that the pain is too great to suffer through another round of chemo. I just hope his last few weeks in our world are less painful. I sneaked in a bit of a higher dose into his pain medication. The doctors wouldn't be happy about it, but it couldn't hurt him any more than the disease already has. The next few pages went on to describe Mr. Clark's life. He used to be a music teacher, even far enough back to have taught my own mother. I was only 4 when I first met him, and though I only knew him for a couple of months, I knew he was a kind man. But even the best people get taken by horrible disease, stolen from this world without reason. I just skimmed through the next pages, surprised at just how normal my mother seemed. Based on the little I'd read in her diary that far, she was a compassionate, kind woman, just like the lawyer had said. April 19th, 1997. Mr. Clark died last night. Took his last breath when I was sleeping. I'd promised to be there with him when the time came, but I failed him. There was just no real warning signs. He seemed fine the evening before, and we expected him to have at least another week left. He just died. Died in silence without a soul noticing. He drew his last breath, and the world just didn't change. He was pronounced dead when the morning staff found him at 5:34 a.m. Just like that. But that's not the worst part. Because when we moved him to the morgue, I accidentally touched his arm, and I could have sworn I felt it twitch. I told the other nurses to stop, but they just kept going, claiming I'd imagined the whole thing. I turned to the next page, but to my surprise it had been ripped out. In fact, as I flipped through the rest of the diary, I found that several were missing. I went through the entire thing page by page, but without the missing information as context, it was a pointless task. Though what she had left behind seemed normal enough, I couldn't know for sure without getting the rest of the diary. The business card that rested on the kitchen table started to look all that more tempting. Yet something held me back, an odd feeling I just couldn't shake, hidden somewhere beneath the heavy sense of curiosity. Had my mother really been crazy? I had to know. I picked up the card and dialed the number. At first, I couldn't bring myself to hit call. I just sat there and stared at the 10-digit number. For all I knew, there was no mystery. My mother was simply crazy. But the possibility was still there, and the only thing that separated me from all the answers I needed was a simple phone call. "Hello, this is John Riley. How can I help you?" he said as he picked up the phone. "Hey, it's me, Laura Florence," I responded meekly. "Oh, hello, Miss Florence. I didn't think to hear back from you so soon. Have you decided what to do?" "Yeah, I'm coming with you back to Tenebrae." I sort of knew the way to Tenebrae myself, at least with a map. Nevertheless, my car was held up in the garage as it awaited the missing parts it desperately needed for repairs. Riley offered to drive, promising the entire trip wouldn't last more than a week, and that he'd guide me through all the necessary paperwork. That night, I couldn't let go of the diary. I combed through the old paper, trying to figure out which parts had gone missing. Most of the stuff written there seemed normal, even tame. Apart from a few offhand sentences, my mother seemed like a perfectly normal person. All the answers I sought were hidden within the missing pages. I knew that much. I figured that if I couldn't read them myself, maybe some answers had been left behind in the room I inherited. Then, as I held the diary in my hand, I felt a small cut in the leather. Just on the inside of the back page, it revealed a perfectly hidden pocket, and there was something inside it. I gently tugged and pulled on the folded piece of paper, careful not to tear it as I removed it from the pocket. It was one of the missing pages, filled to the brim with frantic handwriting. It was messy, but clearly written by my mother. The date on it was listed as August 4th, 2000. The very day I got sent to my grandparents at the age of 7. Dear Laura, they're not letting me leave Tenebrae, but I can't let them take you too. I'm sending you away to live with your grandparents. Hopefully they can keep you safe as I figure out a way to stop this nightmare. There's something wrong with the people in this town. At first, it was just the patients at the hospice care. They kept coming back from the dead, acting strangely as if they weren't the same people anymore. But then it started to spread. People were dying all around town, only to come back to life as they arrived at our morgue. It's my fault. I am part of this, and I don't know if I can stop it. I'm hiding this note in my diary, only to be given to you once I'm dead. I pray you never have to read this, but if you do, you have to stay away from Tenebrae. It's not safe here. Please forgive me. I'm going to try to... The rest of the page was smudged beyond intelligibility, as if the page had been tucked away before the ink had a chance to dry. She was telling me to stay away, but that was over 20 years ago. If Tenebrae truly was dangerous, the threat had to be gone by now. I mulled over my options, but the desperate desire still occupied my every thought. I had to figure out what happened to my mother. I had to go to Tenebrae.